by definition of the Agile, I think they have all the right in the world to say that SAFe's not Agile. But I think it would be totally unfair to say that under the right conditions, it couldn't create greater business agility.
Hey, this is Dave Pryor. Welcome to Leading Agile SoundNotes. I'm here with Mike Cottmeyer. Mike, thanks for taking time out of your Friday afternoon.
Hey, Dave. Thanks for having me, man. Always appreciate being on these podcasts with you.
I appreciate you being here. So we're going to talk about SAFe today. There was something that happened on the interweb this week that kind of got you thinking about it. What was that?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't spend a ton of time browsing around LinkedIn anymore. I kind of make sure that I don't have any inbound traffic coming in or anybody that's trying to really get a hold of me. But I was poking around in my news feed, and there was a post, and I apologize, I can't remember where it came from, but it was a gentleman who either shared or repurposed or something a post from a while ago where basically all the signers of the Agile Manifesto were in effect in unison saying that SAFe was not an Agile methodology. And I find that just super interesting, right? And so, I was reading and just kind of getting myself updated on people's different perspectives and kind of where the industry's at and how they're thinking about it. Yeah.
So there's this part of me that's got this mental image of all of them standing around in a circle kicking Dean. But does it, I guess the first thing I want to ask is, does it matter if SAFe is Agile or not?
Well, that's actually kind of the point that I was going down, right? Because, I had this really, maybe, gosh, I tell a little history here. I want to say it was 2007, 2006, maybe. I got involved with the APLN. You remember that group? I don't know if they're like around now, right? It was the Agile Project Leadership Network. And a lot of really interesting people. Christopher Avery was in it at the time, and a guy from Denmark named Ole Jebsen, who I became pretty good friends with, .tutor. I met her through that. A bunch of the OGs in the Agile community. And during that time, I got to meet Alistair Coburn. And I'll say this publicly, I've become friends over the years. And but I mean, the first time I was sitting next to him, it was literally like sitting next to a rock star. I was like, oh, that's Alistair Coburn. I was like super excited, right? I was like super geeked over it. And still, he remains to this day one of the most foundational thinkers in the Agile community, the one I resonate with the most. I haven't followed him down the hard Agile path, even though it's brilliant and it's simple. We're kind of in scale and transformation and things, but super influenced by that guy's thinking. And sometime after that, a couple years later, I got to spend some time with him and David Spann up in North Carolina. Okay. And what was cool about it, just got to talk a lot about personal stuff, got to know each other, right? Did some fun things, Whitewater Center up there. It was cool. But during that conversation, I just was asking him some questions, right? Mm-hmm. And one of the things that he said, and this is like early days of Scaled Agile, right? So I don't know that the backlash had really hit. And we were talking about Scaled Agile. And he said something, and I'm paraphrasing, that was to the effect of, like, what we invented when we were building these methodologies and defining the Agile Manifesto, it was like a thing, right? Mm-hmm. And now I'm kind of ad-libbing here, but that thing was like small teams, co-location, on-site customers, iterative and incremental delivery, continuous feedback, continuous deployment, right? All the things that we do, right? And he goes, it's not that Scaled Agile is bad. It's just that it's just not what we invented.
Yeah.
Right. And so like the way that I think about it is it Agile by the definition of Agile in the Agile Manifesto, or is it in the same class as methodologies like XP and Scrum? Right. I would suggest no. Right. I would suggest no. But to your question, does it matter? What you're asking yourself is does SAFe have the opportunity to enable greater business agility?
Yeah. Well,
and I think on some levels it could be yes, but the devil's in the details, right? Because there's just like a lot of people are going through the motions of doing Team Scrum, right? And not actually able to get the business benefit out of that. Obviously there's tons of organizations that have gone through SAFe implementations, and aren't getting the business bits from those. So like I'm pretty good at distinguishing between does the methodology work and have people actually created the conditions for the methodology to work.
Sure.
Because, in Scrum, you have teams and teams have to operate off the backlogs, working test the software. With SAFe, it's similar. It's like you have to have encapsulated value streams. I mean, you have to have it organized in a way that it actually leads to agility.
Right.
But, it's like properly applied. Yeah, I think it can make a difference. And I think it can lead to agility, not necessarily agile per se. That's how I think about it.
So I think this might resonate with you, but I want to check in on it. There's this part of me that when I first encountered SAFe, I felt like all those Agile guys, Alistair and everybody else, they had tried to take all the project management out of project management and make it as pure a thing for them to work on as possible. And I felt like Dean went and got all those project management tools and put them back in the hands of a bunch of Agilists, they were like, what is this wrench thing? And they just kept using it wrong. And I felt like that was one of the challenges with SAFe, is that people were not using it right. And even when I would talk to people other than Dean and they would explain SAFe to me, it made no sense. But when he talked to me, it made sense. And his basic answer was, people are asking these questions, I'm just giving them an answer.
Right.
So the scaling thing was there. I think the scaling thing was there from the beginning. Maybe that wasn't what Alistair and everybody else was worrying about.
Well, let's
wasn't
talk
that question always present?
So at the time that Agile emerged in the marketplace, 2001, signing of the manifesto, I think about like what I was doing during that time, because I was in project management at that time. So I was clearly doing my share of the PMI stuff.
Right.
And, PMI, to this day, I believe still has the idea of rolling wave planning, progressive elaboration, right? There's nothing in the PMI framework that says you have to do big upfront design or that you have to do waterfall. And then, rational unified process, right? So rational unified process was a way, I think, an early stage way of trying to figure out how to operate incrementally and iteratively in a larger scale framework. And so RUP's clearly not agile for the same reason SAFe cannot be agile, but could rational unified process increase agility, increase early risk mitigation, increase constant delivery? Like, yeah, for sure.
Can I ask you a question about that really quick?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I want to come back to the question on Agile, though.
Yeah, I had never thought of this before. This will only take a second. But to me, what makes SAFe like dissonant against Agile is the same thing that makes RUP dissonant with Agile. And there's just so much stuff you're supposed to do. How do we get it down to this pure, clear thing where I'm just building something in a couple of days?
So here's like the challenge, right? So if you were doing like a small team Agile project, like we have a small dev team in LeadingAgile that builds an internal product that we have. And, we barely use Scrum formally. I mean, we have, we kind of have a notion of a backlog in Jira and we meet on regular cadences, but, we're not doing story point estimates. We're not doing burn downs and things like that, because like at the end of the day, I just don't really care, right? As long as we're incrementally putting things in market and figuring out and learning and adapting, then, that's all I really care about. So I don't even care about the formality of Scrum in my own world. But as you get into more environments where you are using other people's money or non-discretionary dollars and you're trying to build something for market on a schedule, things like that, then more structure and discipline, even at the single team level, is appropriate.
Okay.
What starts to happen at scale, and I'm not saying this is right or wrong, I'm just saying it's what it is. You have, very complex ecosystems. And it's not just the software that is complex, right? So we have the technical architecture, right? Poorly architected software, sometimes poorly designed systems, things that are not inherently modular. Right. The value stream encompasses other parts of the business, marketing, sales, finance, legal, right? All this kind of stuff. Sometimes like professional services and support and custom development and things like that. And so in the presence of dependencies between teams and more complex external environments that have to be dealt with, then what SAFe really did is it came along as it said, okay, this is how we're going to group larger teams of teams. The only thing other than really RUP or small team Agile when SAFe emerged was it's really a concept of Scrum of Scrums. And I'll even tell you an interesting thing, right? So I actually believe, as I've talked with Alistair, I've gotten to spend a little bit of time with Jeff Sutherland, a little bit of time with Jim Highsmith over the years. And one of the things I was explaining, we have this pattern that we use often where instead of a Scrum of Scrums, like what we'll have is we'll have multiple Agile teams that are as independent as we can possibly get them. But sometimes there's requirements dependencies, cross-cutting concerns. Sometimes there's technical dependencies. And we'll create a small work group. In the early days, I used to call it a product owner team. And I would get like different points of view, not different people, but different points of view, like an architecture, senior developer point of view, product point of view, like an analyst or a tester point of view, kind of a project management point of view. And what we would do, and I did this in my early days at CheckFree before I even became like an Agile guy. And what we do is we get this small group of people and we'd ideate on the backlog. And we would sequence the backlog and we would create design-aware user stories and sequenced. And what we would do is we basically run features through a Kanban. And then the feature Kanban would feed user stories down into the team level. So as the teams were developing user stories, they would roll up into features and then features would get integrated and deployed, right?
So that sounds like a scaling model that you came up with.
Well, it was like really in the early days, right? Because we were formerly a waterfall company. We had RUP officially sanctioned. The teams were in practice doing Scrum and XP at the work surface level, but really complex environments where we had dependencies and cross-cutting concerns and, requirements that had to be in sync and lined up. And, the teams just weren't independent, right?
Okay.
So long story short, right, the only metaphor that Agile had offered to date for orchestrating across multiple teams is this idea of Scrum of Scrums. And the problem with Scrum of Scrums for me has always been, at least as commonly implemented, it's very reactive. It's like the way it was described to me originally, it was like, well, the Scrum teams do their daily stand-up and then all the Scrum Masters get together and they do like a Scrum of Scrums where they're all talking about impediments across the teams and stuff like that. And what I would always see in practice is that like every team pretty much overcommits the sprint and there's not a lot of slack in the system. And so if we discover a dependency through the course of the sprint, like what do I do with it, right? I can escalate it and I could put it in somebody else's backlog, but now it's in my backlog. The other team's backlog's at capacity and they can't resolve the dependency for me in the course of the sprint. And so my user story gets pushed until they can sequence it in their backlog. And then there's maybe prioritization or contention or bottlenecks, that kind of a thing. And so what I offered to Jeff, he happened to be in town he was doing a CSM class and I think he hosted it. He came to our user group in Atlanta and then a lot of us went out to dinner and drinks afterwards. It was kind of the context of this. And I asked him, I said, hey, I've found, the kind of Scrum of Scrums pattern kind of problematic. And this is what we've been doing to overcome it. And he goes, that sounds like a great idea. Do that. And I went, oh, fascinating. So he wasn't like it wasn't him that was being dogmatic. He basically identified a pattern of coordination and was like, do what makes sense. And I actually had a lot of respect for him after that. I always respected him, but I had more respect for him after that because I'm like, oh, it's not the inventors of Agile that are being incredibly dogmatic. It's like us practitioners out here that are taking it and being really dogmatic about it. And so,
but that's the same thing with SAFe and Dean. He would say the same thing.
Yeah. For sure, right? My only thing with Dean and SAFe one time is, when Dean wrote the Agile Software Requirements book, or Scaling Software Agility book, I think was the first one he wrote. I was like, crap, that's the book I wish I would have written, right? And I got to meet Dean. I want to say we were in not Colorado Springs, doesn't matter, Fort Collins. We were in Fort Collins for like a Lean Software and Systems Consortium thing, and a few of us were getting inducted as fellows into that. Me and Dennis Stevens were out there. And I've been friendly with Dean over the years. Friends might be a little strong, but we've been friendly with talk. We know who each other are, right? He quoted me in one of his books one time, which was pretty cool. And I said, Dean, like, here's the challenge, man. It's like there's huge organizational design issues that are getting in the way of being able to do these methodologies. And I think that's a huge gap. And I think leaving that gap unaddressed, I don't think I said it this strongly at the time, but it's irresponsible because people are applying this wrong. And he goes, yeah, I get it. But he was very explicit. It's the org design is totally out of scope and it's the domain of consultants. And I was like, fascinating. right? And so what Dean is selling is a methodology that rides over top of at least theoretically a well-formed organization. And so I think of the conditions that you have to create in order to really implement SAFe is I think you need encapsulated Scrum teams at the work surface level, and I think you need encapsulated value streams or encapsulated release trains. But it's like anything. It's like whenever there are dependencies in place, you have to figure out how to manage the dependencies. And where Agilists get in trouble, I think, is when they start doing Agile and they say either we'll resolve the dependencies late, or the teams will self-organize them in some way, or we just ignore them altogether. And when you do that, right, you create a tremendous amount of disruption and chaos in the delivery process. And so what I suggest is, so getting back to our question is SAFe Agile. Like Agile is a small team methodology that is very heavily predicated on the idea of complete cross-functional teams, access to a customer, the ability to potentially ship every week or two. Most organizations do not have that, right? So they're using Scrum in the absence of that condition being created. I would suggest that most SAFe organizations are using SAFe in a way where they don't have the right level of encapsulation. And but regardless, I would say even a well done SAFe implementation, and they exist, right? A well done SAFe implementation is the language I use for our stuff. It's a compensating control in the presence of dependencies. And I actually ripped that off from Chris Beal, who's on my leadership team. As he came out of a really heavy XP software craftsmanship background, and when he joined us 5-6 years ago, to his credit, he really suspended a lot of disbelief and was like, "Why are you guys doing this? Why are you doing transformation that way?" And he went all in. And as he started, and he actually gave me that language, I was very appreciative for it. It's like in the presence of dependencies, in the presence of poorly formed teams, in the presence of corporate governance and heavy command and control and all those things, right? There's things that you need to do to be able to compensate for the lightweight nature of Scrum. And those compensating controls ideally are rolling wave planning, progressive elaboration, incremental and iterative delivery on some sort of more frequent boundary, right? So it's like, is it Agile? No, right? Can you do Scrum at the team level? Sure. Are the compensating controls defined in the manifesto? No. Are they defined in Scrum? No, right? And so the way I look at it is like, I'm a solid believer in the underlying reference architecture of Scrum. I think the underlying reference architecture of SAFe. I'm getting my methodologies mixed up. I think the underlying architecture of LAS, SAFe, disciplined agile delivery, what we do typically in our multi-tier models in LeadingAgile, I think they're all based upon the same reference architecture type patterns. And what we do is we get down to different reference implementations based upon your assumptions about dependencies. And I think LAS has it largely right, but the problem is that they assume away a lot of the dependencies that exist in most real organizations. SAFe kind of acquiesces to the dependencies and doesn't suggest that you do anything about them other than manage it. And my point of view is in between. Like, when we hit like a base camp 1 Agile implementation, we're going to do teams, we're going to organize, we're going to understand dependencies, we're going to orchestrate dependencies heavily, we're going to do roadmaps, and we're going to do look ahead work, and we're going to manage the heck out of those dependencies. Where I think SAFe goes wrong a little bit is that it's defined as like the methodology for doing things at scale. And I think what it does is it encourages people to say, this is it. Like, this is what Agile means for you because you're a large organization. And I think that's why there's so much flack, because it's not like it's like setting itself up as the desired end state.
And wouldn't you say the same of LAS or DAT or any of them, like Nexus? I mean, they're all doing that.
I have a fairly nuanced opinion on those methodologies. And again, I'm not deep into it, so if anybody wants to blow me up over it, it's totally fine. The way I look at it is that SAFe's kind of an orchestration mechanism in the presence of dependencies. I think LAS largely less largely assumes away the dependencies and describes a model for how multiple teams would kind of roll up into more complex software if they didn't have dependencies between them, and every team was operating independently, but in a broader, more integrated, complex software environment, right? Yeah. The way that I understand disciplined agile delivery, and it's been a minute since I read Scott's book, but in large part, it almost was like it was a progressive elaboration. Like it really read to me a lot like inception, elaboration, construction, transition from Rupp. Because and again, I don't think he uses these words, but again, it's probably been 10 years or something since I read that book. The way that and we don't encounter disciplined agile delivery in the wild very often, but the way that rationally unified process was structured is you have this inception, elaboration, construction, transition. And the way that we used to implement Rupp with Scrum was very similar to disciplined agile delivery. So we would be sprinting. You could have a sprint 0, but your early sprints are validating that the business problem is solvable and will be accepted in market, right? So it's almost lean startup-like, where we're running experiments to see if the business problem is valid. And then elaboration, that's where you get into we understand the architecture, we understand, and this is another Alistair Coburn thing, the idea of a walking skeleton. What are the use cases or user stories that are going to prove and validate the major architectural decisions? Because we want to take technical risk out during elaboration. In construction, that's where we've validated the business problem, we've mitigated the technical risk, and now we're just kind of iterating through the system. And then as we're handing it off to the client through transition, then we're it's not that the client's not seeing it or maybe even not using it, but again, right, we're talking about a different class of scale and a different time in the evolution of software development, right? So I look at disciplined agile delivery as almost like Scrum with a Rupp, inception, elaboration, construction, transition wrapper. Again, I don't know that it says that anywhere in Scott's material, but that's how I interpreted it when I read it. And then, Nexus is, I always found somewhat impenetrable. It almost struck me as not really a scaling mechanism, but a way of inspecting and adapting and building a scaling mechanism dynamically for your company. I never really read Nexus as particularly prescriptive in anything. But again, right, what these quote scaled methodologies are trying to do is, in the presence of uncertainty and risk, when it takes a lot of teams to be able to deliver a large project. Now you can make arguments that we shouldn't do large projects and they're bloated and there's too much overhead and we should have smaller teams of craftsmen. Sure, we got it, right? But it's just not the reality in most organizations, right? So again, I think of SAFe is like a transition pattern. We actually, again, in an early stage transformation, we have to have more compensating controls than SAFe even prescribes. A lot of the SAFe challenges we see are from poorly formed organizations that are doing insufficient backlog management ahead of PI planning. They get PI planning and they're kind of making up the backlog. They don't make it up granularly enough, and so then they don't get as clean an idea on where all the dependencies are. The dependencies aren't sequenced across the teams. Because you think about if you're dealing with dependencies, even in a PI, in a release train, the way that you deal with dependencies is you have to front load the dependencies, right? So you have to reduce the risk of those dependencies first, which means that all of, to the extent possible, all of the dependent user stories need to be sequenced early in their respective sprints. So that we reduce the risk of late integration, we reduce the risk of identifying dependencies later, something not working, what have you. And so without some intent, I just find in practice that just requires more than getting people in a room for 2 days, right? Yeah. That thought work is pretty important. And so I've moved toward in an organization that wants to do SAFe, I'm fine with that. But I do a lot more backlog grooming in advance, a lot more readiness in advance of the PI planning. And then let's get everybody in the room. And now we kind of know what it is we're doing. We can talk about the dependencies and talk about sequencing and all these different things and what we think the release scope should be. So I think there's room for compromise in all of this. But again, going back to the original hypothesis or the original statement, is that what the signatories of the manifesto were describing? No. Right, but it doesn't mean that it's bad.
I mean,
right?
it almost seems to me like those were questions they couldn't see coming. It's sort of like saying, what did the people that wrote the Declaration of Independence think about music streaming? I mean, when the problem that Alistair and everybody else was solving then was, how do we get past all this waterfall nonsense and give a team autonomy and purpose and let them figure out their own way, which they fixed that problem. And then somebody went, yeah, but what if we have 200 teams in the organization? Yeah. And it's like, figure it out.
Yeah. The biggest problem that I see with all this methodological work, right, is, I go back to, I think through, and I might not have my history exactly right, but I think I'm close. Like that methodology, I think came out of Rally software development and BMC. I think Israel Gatt was involved in that. Dean was there as an early stakeholder in Rally. And, what I suspect that they did is they had a certain set of conditions at BMC and they built a methodology around those conditions. Okay. And I don't know anything about what was going on during that time, but I'll assume it worked, right? Or else why would they, I'm just assuming it worked, right? So I always say, I think every methodology works. Every methodology has worked.
In one place at one time.
It was invented for a context, right?
Yeah.
And then what we do is we take the practices that worked in that context, and then we think we can lift and shift the practices without instantiating that context.
Right.
And so when we go in, it's like if somebody says, hey, I want to be less, I want to be SAFe, I want to be disciplined agile delivery, I want to do pure play Scrum, I want to do lean startup, cool, right? Mm-hmm. I don't care, right? What I care about is that the conditions are created to do that methodology well. Because the worst thing that you could do is a really lightweight, lean startup, crystal clear kind of approach. If you're one team of 100 that's operating in a 50-year-old COBOL mainframe platform. Yeah. It's that's just not
challenges.
Enough.
Yeah.
That's not enough structure, right? And you can't just wave your hand and say that the teams will figure it out. That only works if the team is an encapsulated entity. Can you think about what is a Scrum team? Scrum team is designed to be like a black box. The input is the backlog coming from the product owner. The output is working tested software. And I know this isn't popular anymore, but I'm a big believer in stable velocity, sustainable pace, right? So we want yesterday's weather. We want the team to be operating at this pace indefinitely. And I believe that the only way this works is if you can establish stable velocity against a known backlog, then you can start to anticipate time and scope, cost and scope against a set time.
Just to maybe get past the part that you just dangled the fish above all the sharks, do you want to say that when you say stable velocity, that would also be akin to a continuous flow of work through the system?
Well, so not necessarily, right?
Just before they all start.
When I started, tweeting. So we'll get on a little bit of a rabbit hole and see if I can pull back up. So back in my version 1 days, the whole idea of no estimates came out. And what no estimates was really, in my opinion, fundamentally saying was that you want to basically have continuous flow, and on whatever period of performance you count the number of things you built, and that in effect is your velocity. So don't worry about estimating, don't worry about sprint planning, don't worry about planning poker, don't worry about stable velocity. Just build things. But that entire movement, in my opinion, is predicated on the idea that you've broken things down to where they're all very similarly sized. And I would suggest that if you are breaking things down with sufficient understanding that they're all similarly sized, you're in effect estimating, right? And so I think it's a little bit of a semantics game, right? So if you want to break everything down into, using planning poker words like a one or three or whatever, and you're pretty consistent. But if you're counting the number of things and you've got a few 21s in there and a bunch of ones and the occasional 8 and occasional 13, then, that's
Different
not going
game.
to be very predictive in terms of being able to anticipate anything. So it probably doesn't matter.
Okay.
And again, kind of like in my world with my team, it's like, I don't care what their velocity is. I don't care what their sustainable pace is. It's like they're producing value for me, and that's all I care about. But I'm a relatively unique environment for a developer, and most corporate things are like, they've got a budget, they've got a timeline, they have to have a pretty good idea of what is going to be produced, right? All that kind of stuff. So stable velocity for me, and I learned this from a boss I had probably almost 20 years ago, because we still had the idea in the Scrum guide of a sprint commitment. And the way it was described to me before I even read my first Agile book was, the team can sign up for whatever it wants to sign up for. Mm-hmm. But at the point it commits it needs to do it. And if they realize they overcommitted in a sprint, they can back off the next sprint, and they can operate at a more sustainable pace. But to me, the only thing that, and again, most corporate environments, and I'm not saying this is every team everywhere, but in general, for whatever the period of performance is, I need to know the size of my backlog. And I need to know the velocity of the team, right? So which is the measure of points or whatever can get done in the course of a sprint. Yeah. And, if I have 200 points in my backlog and my velocity is 25 points per sprint for the team, then I know it's going to take me 8 sprints. Or if I have to be released in 4, then I can only do half the
scope. Take out some points. Yeah.
I mean, to me, that's just the way it works. I mean, that's like Mike Cohn, Agile Estimating and Planning 101 stuff, right? It's and I think that's the only thing that separates. So if I'm talking to a team and I'm like, do you guys have stable velocity? And they're like, no. I'm like, do you guys have a backlog that's planned at least several sprints, probably a release in advance? Those are indicators that team is not going to stabilize delivery. And I can guarantee you they're not making meeting commitments at the end of a release. And what stems from that is the business is probably really frustrated with them because they can't make promises. They don't. And
those problems are going to exist regardless of whether you're doing Scrum or SAFe or whatever. I mean, those are just problems in how teams function, like a fundamental thing.
So the hard part is, so it's problems, but they're fixable problems. The number one thing that we do is the number one thing, right? So, I mean, we do a lot around teaming strategies and dependency management and stuff like that, and breaking dependencies over time as we move through base camps. But the key insight probably hit me 18 years ago or something. And it's a small group of people that are taking epics to features to user stories, 3 to 4 sprints up to a release ahead of the team. And what we find is that you can do a ton of Agile, right? You get Scrum to work. You get everything to work. You get continuous flow at the feature level across teams. You can get that organization incredibly predictable. Now, does the team get to decide everything about what they do? No. Does the team get to decide everything that's in their backlog? No. Right? Is the team necessarily working directly with a customer? No. And so maybe that's not Agile, right? Okay, fine. But it's team-based, iterative, and incremental delivery that behaves a whole lot like an Agile team, right? It's just that it has to be coordinated because we're doing more complex deliverables, and it's just really difficult to self-organize across. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just saying in general, it just doesn't happen, right? People tend to want to locally optimize. They tend to focus on what they're responsible for, especially if there's personality challenges across teams and complexity that's difficult to understand. Right? It's a mess, right?
So there's this part of me that's thinking about the whole idea of working software over comprehensive documentation. And tying that back to Agile. And I'm thinking what their intent was deliver valuable stuff for the customer, whatever, if it's Agile.
Well, remember back into our waterfall days.
If that's true, why are they then like, you're not Agile? Like, who cares?
Well, because again, it gets back to that Alistair quote. It's like, it was a thing, right? They invented a thing, right? It's like people will ask you, and I know they asked me, it's like, well, how do you do Scrum if you don't have product owners? Well, you don't, right? Scrum requires a product owner. It's like, how do you play chess without a king and a queen? How do you play chess without the right size board? How do you play chess without pawns? Like, you don't.
Yeah.
Right? So Scrum is a game that is defined as a team of 5 to 7 product owner, Scrum Master. It describes the rules of engagement. It describes the way of operating that if you can properly install will guaranteed work. It just
sure.
works, right? There's no, it's like, I remember.
But that's the rub right there. Properly install is a really tall order.
But here's like this again, like I get really hung up on this stuff. Like, Schwaber, I had 2 Schwaber quotes in a talk I did a few years ago. And one was something like, you can't argue whether Scrum works. It's like arguing whether chess works. Either you play the game or you don't play the game. You play by the rules. You don't play by the rules, right? And then the other thing he said was something like 70 or 80% of the teams doing Scrum won't get the business value that they expect from it. And because, right, the fundamental kind of predication of Scrum is you start doing Scrum will show you your impediments, and then
you'll fix them.
Scrum Master works to resolve the impediments, right? Well, if the impediments are, I don't have the right skills on the team. If the impediments are, I'm working on top of a legacy mainframe, tightly coupled code, and every time I change something else breaks. If my constraint is the release management practices of the organization, and I'm a single team, right? You can't fix those things, right? The Scrum Master can't resolve them. So what happens is that we have an army of people that are running around going through the motions of Scrum. They see the impediments. They can't do anything about them. So they start ignoring them. And then they start bending Scrum to be able to accommodate the dysfunction of the organization. And that's not the way it's supposed to work, right?
Which is the same thing they do with SAFe.
Same thing they do with SAFe, 100%, right? So 100%, right? So the reason why, I became so adamant on this idea of systems first transformation is, so sure, it's some upfront planning, and sure, it's some organizational design, and sure, it's some architectural work. But if I can get the teaming strategies right, the dependencies identified, the orchestration mechanisms in place, an agreement across the organization about what dependencies we're going to break over time, how we're going to improve, like all that stuff is like knowable, right? And you don't have to just start doing Scrum and discover it and stub your toe and, yank the organ. Like there's a way of knowing these things. Same with SAFe, to your point, right? SAFe is, and again, the way I look at SAFe, if properly done, it's really just all those independent agile teams operating at the work surface level. And we're going to roughly group them into release trains, like, value streams and such. And we're going to put a big planning event around it. Like, okay, cool. Like party time. Like I have no problem with that. Yeah. Right. But again, in the presence of extreme dependencies between teams or extreme dependencies between release trains or value streams or what have you, or portfolios, right? Anytime there's dependencies, it's going to get in the way, and you're going to put in more orchestration rules. The only way to deprecate the, again, like we're not like real big on like the SAFe implementation details, but the patterns, I see why Dean put them in there, because in the presence of dependencies, you have to have orchestration mechanisms. So if you don't want the orchestration mechanisms in SAFe, then what you have to do is you have to deprecate them over time. And here's the problem, right? This is some of the bad behavior that, sometimes we'll get the opportunity to come in behind another consultancy that is taken, maybe a very pure play agile point of view. And a lot of times what they'll do is they'll take a lot of people out of the legacy organization and they'll go build basically like a greenfield kind of like labs type environment.
Magical Agile land.
It's magical Agile land, right? And, it's very much, I was actually talking with a client earlier this week, and I was quoting Al Shalloway he was from Net Objectives, sold Net Objectives to PMI. I think he's out doing his own thing at some point now. I can't recall the name of his company. But he had wrote a blog post at one point in time talking about the failure mode of Agile. And it was exactly that. It's like you take this legacy chaotic organization, you create this idealized pilot, you enable it with the practices of Scrum, and then you take the Scrum practices and you bring them back into the legacy organization. What does that say?
Scrum is magic. Magic.
And so, but what you forget was the secret sauce wasn't the daily stand-ups and the reviews and retrospectives and the planning. The secret sauce is I had a dedicated team that could release on regular intervals and get feedback from a customer. And that will always work if you create those conditions. The only time Scrum won't work is when you don't have the right conditions created. Again,
which most places don't have.
For SAFe. Right.
Okay.
So my message, to the signers of the manifesto, my message to the Agile community would go something like this, right? It's like Agile by definition is a small team methodology. And if it's multiple teams, it's very lightweight orchestration because the dependencies are very lightweight.
Okay.
And if those conditions exist, like do pure play Agile all day long. When in the presence of dependencies or poor org design or whatever, something like SAFe is going to emerge, whether we like SAFe or not. Something like, because you have to orchestrate dependencies.
Somebody's got to answer that question of how
Somebody's
do we
got to
do
answer
it.
the question, right?
Yeah.
And again, I think where SAFe gets in trouble is because everybody wants an easy button. Everybody wants a defined answer. It is an answer in the presence of poorly formed organizations, lots of dependencies. And so using my language, I would say that SAFe is a compensating control for when you can't create the conditions to do Agile well. And so if you wanted to start with SAFe and that worked, like that's great, right? And if it works for you, it works for you. If it's not working for you, then what you have to do is you have to figure out it's always dependencies that are going to be the problem, either dependencies between value streams, release trains, Agile teams, whatever.
Right.
And so if you don't like the overhead of SAFe, break the dependencies between teams and allow them to operate independently.
Okay.
I'm just telling you that is not something most leaders can do by fiat, because the way their organizations are designed and the way their tech stacks are designed, it just doesn't lend itself to that. So that's what transformation is. Transformation is about creating the conditions to be able to do Agile well. Okay. And I think that's largely the reason why. I'm not saying everybody in the Agile community likes our stuff. I'm not sure even anybody knows like how many people know about our stuff, but it's like I think we managed to lessen the heat, even though I'll do stuff that's heavier than SAFe sometimes. Like it's just, that's the first step in the journey. Yeah. The fifth step in the journey, Basecamp 5 for us, is lightweight, lean startup teams that are locally funded directly and with the customer, right? All those things. And ideally that's where we'd like to go. But pragmatically in a lot of organizations, I actually flipped this stat across a customer's whiteboard the other day, and I don't know that it's exactly true, but I think it's pretty close to true. Is about 70% of the teams are or 70% of the organization is going to be totally fine in for us a Basecamp 1, Basecamp 2. And for that can be heavier and more plan driven than SAFe. When I start getting to Basecamp 2, Basecamp 3 kind of stuff, that's when I'm thinking, okay, SAFe is probably a decent reference pattern. But then there's going to be parts of the organization, maybe 10% that's going to want to break all those dependencies and be like totally independent of the rest of the stack. Yeah. But that's just not the whole company, right? There's just certain parts in most organizations that are not worth investing in. They're not worth doing the product extraction work, or basically just keeping the lights on. They might be mission critical cash cow kinds of things, but they just don't change all that much.
And it's not a one size fits all. Like not everybody in the company has to wear the same shoes.
Yeah. We did a pretty large, I want to say it was about 13,000 person, let's say, 100, 200 expeditions. That's how we slice organizations up and move them through. And because we look at transformation incrementally and iteratively as well, right? So incrementally, we're breaking a big organization up into lots of small pieces, and then and then iteration wise, we're taking Basecamp 1, Basecamp 2, 3, 4, 5, right? So we're progressively improving each slice as we move that slice to greater levels of business agility. But I think that's why we've avoided some of the noise in the system over that, is because it's like I recognize SAFe for what it is. I recognize where it fits. If you want to create the conditions to do SAFe, do it. I think you can do better, but if SAFe's good enough, okay, cool. Yeah. Do SAFe, right? Okay. And again, I think by definition of the Agile, I think they have all the right in the world to say that SAFe's not Agile. But I think it would be totally unfair to say that under the right conditions, it couldn't create greater business agility. Yeah. Right. And that's really what most organizations are going for. They don't really, give a about whether it's Agile or not. And again, right, Agile is never the point anyway, right? It's Agile is a means to an end. And whether you're looking to change the culture or create a more humane work environment, or whether you're trying to get product into market faster and generate earlier ROI and predictability, right? Whatever you're going for, there's some sort of business benefit you're hunting. And to me, it doesn't matter a whole heck of a lot what you call it.
Okay.
Cool.
So is it Agile or not?
As defined by the signers of the manifesto.
Yes, I'm trying to create the soundbite.
Right? Yeah.
The soundbite.
Well, I mean, it's like, you want a soundbite? No, SAFe is not Agile. I'd say in a lot of environments, though, Agile isn't Agile, right? I mean, I've seen enough small team Agile with none of the overhead of SAFe that can't produce anything in market, right?
Yeah.
So it's like I was having this debate with Dennis the other day, and he was talking a little bit about like why our stuff works and why SAFe fails and things. And I was like, Dennis, people poorly apply what we teach them too, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, it's like you have to judge the methodology by the environment it was designed to work in, what it brings to the table, what assumptions it makes. And then obviously you have, issues with like how closely can we approximate that ecosystem, how,
right.
Even within the proper ecosystem, how well we are applying the approach. And there's just a lot of room for error, right? And so, my general bent is if we can start getting the organization to unlock value and get things in front of customers earlier, that's a win. It's a win, right? And so by definition of the manifesto signers, no, not Agile. By when done properly in the right ecosystem under the right conditions, it can absolutely lead to greater agility for sure.
Thank you very much for doing this.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, thanks for jumping on a Friday afternoon and
it was
having
fun.
a conversation. Yeah, I appreciate it.